you for joining today's event. My name is Lisa Tostado, and I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation in the European Union office. We are the political foundation that is affiliated with the German Greens. And this event is co-organized by the Deutsche Umwelthilfe Environmental Action Germany. I am speaking to you today live from Glasgow, where COP26 is happening, and I was lucky enough to secure a nice spot. So I hope that everything will go well, internet connection-wise and logistic-wise. It is not easy, as you can probably tell from the news in the media with regards to COP26 and around that. This is a digital event that is conducted within the framework of the Methane Pavilion that is physically present here in Glasgow. And that is also virtually present on the website methanemoment.org. methanemoment.org. So I invite all of you to check out that website. It is full of very helpful resources to understand the issue of methane emissions, how to tackle them, what the problem is, etc. And you will also find other events that are happening in the framework of that methane pavilion. Today's event is very timely because just yesterday, the Global Methane Pledge was announced, led by the European Union and the US, and more than 100 countries have so far joined it and have the objective to limit methane emissions by 30% by the year 2030 compared to 2020 levels. And we will probably, or actually definitely, come back to that during the discussion later on. The US recently unveiled a set of regulations for methane emissions focusing on the energy sector, and similar legislation is expected in the European Union as well. The European Commission is going to make a proposal for a methane regulation in the energy sector later this year in December. So that is kind of the political context, the political time at which we come together to speak about the problem of methane leakages. Methane is the second biggest contributor to the climate crisis, right after CO2. It is over 80 times more potent over the 20-year time frame, which makes it really a major thing to tackle if we want to still aim for a pathway to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The main sources of methane emissions are agriculture, energy, and waste. And the energy sector is the sector in which emissions can be reduced and tackled really most rapidly and most cheaply. That's where the lowest hanging fruit really are. Methane leakages appear along the entire supply chain of fossil gas, so extraction, transport, storage, use. And the extent to which such leakages occur is only vaguely known. And where measurements are being done, they often show higher emissions than previously anticipated. And there has long been the assumption that methane emissions from oil and gas infrastructure within Europe are comparably small, and that leakages are mainly an issue for non-EU countries, so the exporting countries that bring the fossil gas into the European Union. But the Clean Air Task Force has been undertaking some observations of oil and gas infrastructure across Europe since the beginning of the year using an infrared camera, and we will hear more about the methodology in a second. And the results published so far call into question the clean slate of the EU on that matter. And today we are getting together to present some of the results of that methane campaign led by the Clean Air Task Force. And then speakers will discuss the findings as well as possible ways to tackle the methane problem in Europe. And we will take a closer look at the German findings, as Germany is the main gas hub of Europe. We will have a number of great speakers, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I invite all of our attendees to use the questions and answer tool. You can also like other people's questions so that they appear higher up, and I will make sure to forward them to our panelists during the discussion later on today. The event is being recorded and live streamed on that methanemoment.org website. So without further ado, I now pass the floor to our first presenter, James Turrito. He's oil and gas campaign manager at the Clean Air Task Force. He is a certified optical gas imaging thermographer, and he focuses primarily on methane emissions in Europe. He joined the Clean Air Task Force in October 2020 to work with civil society groups, media, and government officials on methane leak detection and reduction in the oil and gas sectors. And he will now present some major results and insights from the campaign in Europe. Please, James, the floor is yours, and he is also joining live from Glasgow.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. And thank you to the Hendrik Bohl Foundation and Deutsche Umwelthilfe for organizing this panel today. This is great to have this discussion and take a close look at the policy progress on methane emissions in the EU. So bear with me while I switch over to my screen. So as Lisa mentioned, I joined the Clean Air Task Force in October 2020, working to document methane emissions in the European Union. And this presentation today will focus on a large part of my findings from February to September 2021 over the course of 6 months. Before I begin, I want to just talk a little bit about who the Clean Air Task Force is and what we've been working on. We have been working on oil and gas methane emissions in the United States and around the world for over 20 years now. We've been working primarily in the US at the state level and the national level, as well as in South America, other countries in North America, including Canada and Mexico, and West Africa. We've been focused in the EU over the last 2 years as the discussions of methane emissions have been taking place and have been closely engaged with the European Commission on the methane emissions strategy and plans for methane legislation. My colleague Alessia Veroni, who's also on the panel, will talk a little bit more about our work in the EU and some of the policy positions we're looking to get out of the legislative process. My focus is going to be on what we've been finding in the observations over the last couple months. But I want to highlight something that Lisa mentioned, which is the Global Methane Pledge, which was announced yesterday from the US and EU. This is a major accomplishment coming out of COP26, and we're all very excited about the potential future for methane mitigation. We had over 100 countries sign on to the pledge yesterday, and we're looking forward to working with many of those countries on emissions reductions over the next coming years. Before we get into it, I just wanted to re-highlight also something that Lisa mentioned is the importance of methane emissions and why we need to reduce methane emissions. Almost half of the current warming we're seeing in the world today, 1.1 degrees Celsius, is due to methane emissions. So we see 0.5 degrees Celsius from methane emissions over the last 10 years. Methane is a super pollutant and is extremely powerful global warming. And so over what we've seen over the past couple decades is a significant rise in methane concentrations, starting around the 40s and 50s and really climbing in the last 2 decades. So if we want to be consistent with a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature change, we need to make significant and fast reductions in methane emissions. Fortunately, as has been discussed, particularly in the oil and gas sector, we have the technologies and the tools to do so at very limited costs, and many cases negative costs to the industry. What we need are the right policy regulations put in place in order to move those emissions reductions further.
I'm sorry, James, just a quick interruption.
Yes.
I got the feedback that people cannot hear you well enough, so please just make sure that your mic is a little closer to your mouth. Thank you.
Okay, great. Please let me know if this isn't better. So what I've been doing is traveling through the EU over the last 6 to 8 months with an optical gas imaging camera, a FLIR 320 optical gas imaging camera that's used to detect methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. It has been used for about 15 to 20 years. It was in 2016, It was recommended by the US EPA as a best tool and best practice technology to quickly identify methane emissions and leaks. It is not able to quantify emissions, but it is very quickly able to identify those leaks so that industry operators can make adjustments and fixes to the leaks in a very fast time frame. So in the last, from February to September 2001, I've been to 11 different countries in the EU and visited more than 250 sites. These sites have been in both the upstream and midstream sectors, covering the production aspects, so oil and gas wells in Romania, in Germany, in Austria, and Hungary, as well as in the midstream sector. So primarily looking at gas transmission. These are gas transmission compressor stations and other infrastructure along the pipelines throughout Europe. I've detected emissions at more than 60% of the sites that I've visited. In some of the countries where I've been, the emissions rates have been approximately 90% of the sites that I've visited. So we're seeing large emissions rates across all of the countries in Europe. It's important to note that this is a European-wide problem, and everywhere we take this camera and go look for emissions, we're finding them. So in total, I found more than 425 different sources of emissions. Some of these sources are fairly large and significant, like the photo you're seeing on the bottom of this page here, which was a gas compressor station, which was venting emissions from overpressure in central Romania. Other sources of emissions have been a bit smaller leaks that can easily be repaired with some sort of maybe closing a valve, or in some cases it could be as simple as that. But other cases have been large infrastructure problems as well, such as these rusted out storage tanks, which I saw quite a lot of in Romania. So I've been finding emissions at all types of facilities across the oil and gas supply chain in Europe. These have included wells, gathering stations, transmission stations, including LNG terminals and regasification terminals, and LNG fueling stations that have been part of long-haul trucking with LNG trucks. So what I want to do is show a little bit of the images that I've found across Europe and talk about them a little bit. And then we're going to get into more of a policy discussion with other members of the panel and get their feedback. So this is a site that I visited in Italy and documented over the course of several weeks in April. This is an LNG regasification terminal where they were venting a significant amount of emissions. And what we found was that these emissions were most likely coming from some failures in the valving system along the pipeline. And so the emissions then were being routed to the large emergency vent stacks at these sites. In other cases that I mentioned, we found smaller leaks where the emissions are coming along a pipeline, and this is a screw that is either not fully tightened or it's malfunctioned and needs to be replaced. But this is something where you see possibly a much easier fix, something that can be done in a very quick time frame, should the company spend time to do frequent leak detection and repairs. In other cases, and you know, I've seen pretty much almost everything across the spectrum, but when I was traveling in the oil fields in Romania, I managed to find a pipeline that was leaking from a gathering facility. And so we were in the oil and gas fields in Romania, and the pipeline itself was behind a processing facility. The pipeline happened to just be leaking gas from the ground, and I quickly informed the gas company because I knew it was a fairly significant problem. And so I wanted to make sure that they were aware of the issue. When I informed them, they quickly did respond to the issue and came down to fix the pipeline. So it was something that needed to be fixed quite quickly. Also in Romania, what I've been seeing is a lot of emissions from the oil and gas industry near and very close to populations. So in the town of Campina, which was about 100 kilometers north of Bucharest, we found 2 oil wells that were in a community neighborhood. These were in the middle of the parking lot, and in the parking lot between the 2 wells is a playground that you see in the bottom right corner. Unfortunately, when I was there, the playground was full of children playing after school. And we walked up to the wells, and we could quickly smell the fumes coming from the wells. And so it wasn't a surprise to any of us that were looking at these sites that gas was coming out of it when we started to point the camera. It's important to talk about the toxic health effects of gas that's coming from oil wells when I'm talking about some of these images, because a lot of times we're seeing methane, and methane is not toxic, but in the oil production process and early in when you're extracting gas from underground, there are other toxic pollutants that are associated with oil and gas. And so when you have long-term exposure to these pollutants, such as benzene, and there's also hydrogen sulfide, very toxic and poisonous gases, you can have issues with asthma and cancer in those communities. And these wells, as you saw in this image, were incredibly close to children playing on the merry-go-round and the swings right in the background, less than 5 meters away. So what we've been doing at the Clean Air Task Force is documenting these emissions and then using them to share with policymakers at the EU level. And we're finding that, we're building this library of emissions across the EU, and it's quite effective in terms of raising people's awareness of methane emissions, which was a little known problem in Europe prior to the last year. People talked about how the US was bad with emissions and elsewhere around the world, but many people didn't think that emissions in the EU were as bad as they were. But what my experience has shown, and our experience, is that we are finding these everywhere. The EU is having the same problems as the United States is, as well as other countries with the oil and gas production and processing. It's happening a little bit on a smaller scale than in the US because there's not as much production in the EU, but there is a lot of gas that's transmitted through the EU. And so you have a lot of potential in the midstream as well as the downstream sectors and city distribution grids for emissions. Of course, a lot of those emissions are coming at the upstream and production countries too. And so it's going to be important, as others on this panel will talk about, to work on import standards within the European Union. We have a lot of our materials available online. You can look at our campaign website, cupmethane.eu. I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, Clean Air CATF, as well as on Flickr, where you can see photos and YouTube and videos of our work documenting emissions across Europe. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to others on the panel, or pass it back to Lisa so she can direct others on the panel. And I'm happy for the discussion that this is going to generate. So if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out to me offline, my email address is available there. And I'm happy to talk with anyone about what I've been finding across Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for these insights and the images that you shared with us. Quite impressive. So again, I invite all of our attendees to check out the website. It's really fascinating what you have found so far, and also gives even more reason to act. So we just had an American, I believe, speaking to us from Glasgow. And by the way, no one is unmuted, because I got the feedback that please others should be muted. That was just because James had issues finding a quiet spot in the craziness of COP. So please be indulgent. We now turn to Germany, as I said previously, the biggest gas hub in Europe. We will have Sascha Boden, who is Project Manager, Energy and Climate Protection at Deutsche Umwelthilfe, Environmental Action Germany, the co-organizers of this event. And in that role, he has been involved in different projects around fossil gas already, including, for example, a study on a potential methane levy and performance standard to tackle upstream emissions that James also just mentioned towards the end of his presentation, and also a market survey about how the gas industry is already tackling or not methane emissions today. So we will now hear from Sascha about methane emissions in Germany and the German gas infrastructure and what to do about them. Sascha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Let me just quickly share my presentation. All right, so as said, my name is Sascha Boden. I'm a project manager in the Energy and Climate Protection Department at Environmental Action Germany, or Deutsche Umwelthilfe. And I want to take a closer look. I want you also all to look at what James said and now zoom into one example, which would be Germany in that case, where we as the national partner of Clean Air Task Force have been conducting and organizing events and measurements and media releases on the topic. And I want to look a bit closer into what is going on in Germany, what we found in the beginning or in the middle of this year, and how we've proceeded. So what have we done about the emissions that we found, or that Clean Air Task Force has found in Germany? So first of all, James measured at 15 sites between February and May 2021, basically in two big trips, one in February, one in May, and some additional ones thereafter. And you can see the locations of the measurements on the map on the right side. And you will see that most of them are in the state of Lower Saxony, which is by far the most important site in terms of oil and gas production in Germany as of yet. So there's a lot of infrastructure obviously there. They measured at compressor stations, but also storage facilities, refineries, and other infrastructure. And James said at which percentage of the infrastructure in Europe they found emissions, and in Germany it was also quite high. While some of those emissions that we found were rather small, maybe even insignificant, some others were not. Some others were rather significant, were rather big. And I just want to give you two examples to showcase this. So this is, for example, one compressor station in Rothenstadt, which is Bavaria, on the east side of Bavaria. Towards the border, and this is the central relief stack where if you turn on the flare camera, you can clearly see quite a bit of emissions coming out of this stack. So we do not know from these images, obviously, how high the emissions are, but we know from other projects that they are significantly significant. And we also want to check and make sure that these sorts of emissions that James is filming are not one-time events, but that they are continuous. So let me go to the next slide to kind of show you a second example in this case. We also filmed at Malno, which is one of the biggest entry points for Russian gas in Germany. It's in Brandenburg, so to the Polish border. And James was there twice, first on February 12th, 2021, where he found emissions coming out of one of the stacks. And then April 2021, roughly 2.5 months after, and the emissions were still there. So this is to show that the missions we filmed are not one-time events, and this kind of calls into question really how clean Germany really is when it comes to gas infrastructure. And even though obviously there are results from other countries that are more severe, we still should not forget that we have work to do also in Germany in that matter as the biggest gas market of Europe. What have we done about it? So after we found those emissions, we as the national partner of Cleaner Task Force contacted authorities in June and July of 2021 in the respective states in Germany, mostly Lower Saxony, but also Brandenburg, Thuringia, Saxony, and Bavaria. And we basically asked them to investigate this. So we wanted to have an investigation of the found leaks, especially including a consideration on legal steps. So we wanted to know from them if the emissions that Cleaner Task Force found are severe enough that they should have been reported to the respective regulator, and to obviously introduce maybe legal steps in case that's necessary in the respective cases. And the reaction was really manifold. It was quite an odyssey, I have to say, because I mean the regulating landscape in Germany can be a bit challenging, but we also, yeah, we had the impression that that the authorities themselves found it challenging sometimes to figure out who is responsible for what. What we are doing right now is that we are summarizing all the reactions we got from the authorities, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more detail in a second. We are summarizing them at the moment, and we want to conduct a legal review of the reactions. So we basically want to check if the statements that we got from the national or the subnational authorities are in line with the legal basis in Germany, and if they're all correct, or if there's something that we find is not so correct, so we could maybe challenge that at a later stage. However, we've already summarized that in a rough way. So in order to give you an understanding of how this works in Germany as a federal state, there are obviously different regulators for each federated states, which there are 16 of. And then you also have subsequent regulators for each individual sites. So for example, the compressor station Rückersdorf that you've just seen is in the state of Thuringia, and the state regulator is one of the Landesämter, but the sub-regulator is another regulator in a city. So this is some sort of it's rather difficult sometimes, but we figured it out. And the good thing is that we've got replies from all of them. So sometimes it took a while. So the last response we've received a few days ago, but they all replied quite extensively after a while. However, the responses showed several points that I want to talk to you about. So first of all, jurisdiction was unclear at times. So sometimes the institutions that regulate these emissions on a state level weren't really sure who is responsible for the specific site. So they had to inquire about that first before coming back to us. In some cases, or I would say in most cases, the operators of the facilities did not know about the found leakages. We had some cases where the operators told us after that they've already found the leak, but they haven't communicated it because it was not severe enough, or it was not, they were not legally obliged to report it to the respective regulating authority. And actually in no case did the operators report the emissions to the respective regulator. So this might not be a problem in terms of the legal basis right now. So there are certain thresholds in place that say basically if you're underneath a certain threshold in terms of emissions, this is not an issue and you do not have to report it to the authority. However, one could argue that the emissions are still severe in terms of the new findings that we know now about the contribution of methane to the climate crisis. But these emissions will not be reported, thus they will not be part of the national inventory that Germany has to report to the UNFCCC. Also, as said before, the regulator stated a variety of legal bases depending on where the emissions occurred exactly. So it's a bit complicated in terms of how this works in Germany. For example, if you have a compressor station and you have a leak at a pipeline that goes to the compressor station, this might be subject to a different legal law basis than, for example, a vent that is at the compressor station. And different legal bases apply here, maybe different thresholds apply as well. So this is something that is also part of the legal process or the legal review we are conducting right now to find this out more specifically and go really into detail with this. And there are definitely uncertainties about how the emission thresholds are defined when a leak needs to be reported by the operator to regulators. We know from some background talks as well that it might be possible to circumvent some of those thresholds. So for example, if you have a compressor station and you have, let's say, 3 leaks of different kinds, you can summarize them and then you might exceed a threshold, but you can also not summarize them and just separate them to different parts of this facility, which might enable you to not actually having to report the emissions. And we've also seen that industry exerts an influence on the regulating bodies. So in one example, which is Saxony, Lower Saxony, which is, as I said, the most important one in Germany in terms of gas and oil production, we saw that the reaction of the state authority in that regard, and we did not get any reactions of sub-state authorities, only from the state authority, that this reaction referred to some advocacy groups from the oil and gas industry in Germany, quite big advocacy groups. And we kind of had the feeling that this might as well have come from the advocacy group themselves, which is to say that we are a bit concerned about how the authorities, the regulating authorities, interact with lobby and interest groups in Germany in that regard. And in the case of Lower Saxony, for example, we only got told in the response that basically that the emissions that James found were, quote, neither leaks nor diffuse emissions, but in all cases, they were part of the permitted processes, of the permitted legal working process of those facilities. So where are we going from here? What are the consequences in our view? As I said, we got a lot of responses, which is really good. We are currently reviewing them from a legal basis. But what has already happened, and what is really beautiful and nice to see, is that several operators told us that because of our findings, they tightened their frequency of the emissions monitoring. So for example, maybe before they went to the facility twice a year and did a thorough evaluation of the whole facility. Now they maybe do it 4 times a year. Also, the operators in some cases improved the scrutiny of their monitoring. So for example, before they might have not been obliged to use an infrared camera, but now this will be a standard when they evaluate the whole facility in terms of, or to make really sure that all the emissions that might occur are being evaluated and detected as well. And also some regulators told us, some state regulators told us that because of the emissions findings, they will now put a stronger emphasis on methane emissions as part of the regular checks of the gas infrastructure, because as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that state regulators have to check when they look at a facility, and emissions of methane are maybe only but one of those aspects. So they will pay more attention to that in the future. As a result, thus, many of the found leaks were closed due to our campaign, which is nice because obviously sometimes environmental organizations have the reputation of only just providing bad news and being really critical about stuff. But in this case, we could actually do something really practical and contribute to that, which is really nice. Nevertheless, from our point of view, the monitoring by the regulators must be tightened from a legal point. So voluntary actions seem not to be enough because, as said, most of the cases we found emissions, and the reaction of the authorities also shows us that in many cases, certain parts of the facility were not up to date anymore. They had to be replaced. So this calls for a tighter regulation in terms of legal basis. And the monitoring of the gas infrastructure also needs to be more thorough, as said before. What we also see is that what we would like to see is that the Federal Environmental Agency, which is the federal or the state regulating authority for Germany, that also reports to the UNFCCC, should rely more on measurements and less on calculations, which we think would be really beneficial in terms of evaluating the problem in Germany. And the thresholds for the reporting of emissions to the regulators by the operator must be reviewed. Several points for this, or several reasons for this. There's new information on climate warming effect of methane to be taken into account. And also we know that state regulators are obliged to use global warming potential over 100 years, but there's nothing that keeps them from also including global warming potential over 20 years, which obviously shows another effect and severity of methane emissions in that matter. And the issue of operators evading reporting of emissions must be tackled as well. Last but not least, the political debate on fossil gas exit date needs to be accelerated in our view, especially when it comes, or especially if you look at the energy crisis of the last couple of weeks that has happened in Europe. And just really quickly on the EU level, I think that the EU methane legislation needs to consider the emissions inside and outside of Europe, obviously, and the emissions of the petrochemical industry should be part of that. Obviously, and we will hear more about this monitoring, reporting, and verification terms that some of you might have heard too many times already have to be implemented, leak detection and repair as well. And we need a ban on routing, venting, and flaring. Also, and Lisa teased this in the beginning, we think that a methane pricing model needs to be introduced alongside an emissions performance standard or for imported fossil gas. And we've conducted a study on this, and I will post a link to that shortly in the chat. And we call on the EU Parliament or the EU Commission to adopt the EU Parliament with its own initiative report that actually takes up a lot of the points that I've mentioned before, for example, the inclusion of the petrochemical industry, and also to include the emissions from outside of Europe in their legislation from the EU methane strategy. So the ideas are there, the proposals are there, and now is the time to act. As said, we've conducted a study with the Forum Ökologisch-Soziale Marktwirtschaft in Germany on pricing methane, which shows that the methane emissions can be reduced significantly and with the right mix of measurements and sufficient database. So I will post a link to that in the chat, and I will also post a link to our methane survey in the chat, which we will do again this year, actually next week, and we will evaluate and report on that next year in February. So if you want to keep up to date on that, you can drop me a message at boden@duh.de, and also obviously visit our website for more information. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. As you can all tell, extensive methane knowledge here in this Zoom room. And I also saw that some of you have started to use the questions and answer tool. Over 8 questions have already come in, so please continue to make use of that and also like other people's question up. We will now continue with the panel discussion per se. And after these 2 fairly long inputs that really gave us food for thought, and I'm bringing in 3 more people, 3 new faces to the discussion, who will all get 5 minutes of an opening statement. And we will start with Brendan Devlin from the European Commission. He's advisor for strategy and foresight at DG Energy. And he began working in the European Commission back in the days at DG Competition, leading major cases looking at the gas market in Germany and the North Sea, and has really a year-long experience working on that topic. So please, Brendan, what are your reactions to what you have heard, both from the field campaign and the insights that Sasha brought to us policy-wise, and how does the European Commission want to tackle the issue?
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting to see emissions within the European Union. Of course, we knew they were there. That's the first thing to say. And the other question, the other thing that we should say at this point is that we also know that there are much larger emissions associated with infrastructure outside of the European Union. And we can tell that that is the case because we have, since 2016, a satellite surveillance system, which is on a daily basis downloading 2 terabytes of data about how methane emissions can be seen in the atmosphere. So far, we have seen very, very large emissions in Central Asia, 1 or 2 in America, North America, that is, 1 or 2 in South America. And there have been short instances of large emissions within the European Union. There was one in Germany a few years ago. But the methane emissions that you can see from space are enormous. And the methane emissions that one can see with the type of equipment that we have seen today are relatively small. And I would ask James to give us some proportionality on what the emissions inside the European Union are that he has seen in comparison to, say, some of the larger emissions that have been recorded by the Clean Air Task Force in North America. And that might give us some scale issues. There is also, of course, in the European Union, a methane emission question associated with abandoned coal mines and operating coal mines. for which it's much more difficult to create usable data. And that's something that we need to bear in mind for the future when working on methane abatement. I saw a question by Wolfgang Koppel about where does man-made anthropogenic methane come from, and we have this slide which you can see in front of you, which breaks it down to the best of our knowledge. The first thing to bear in mind about this slide is that all of the numbers on it are wrong. They're our best guess of what is happening at the present time. These numbers derive from the Global Methane Assessment, which is published by the United Nations and the United Nations Climate and Clean Air Coalition, I should say. And these figures are a working breakdown of the methane that we know is in the atmosphere. The one thing that we do know is the total level of methane in the atmosphere, because that we can measure. Where it comes from is more difficult. And this slide gives you an overview of where we think it is coming from at the moment. In the most recent GMA, Global Methane Assessment, published by the United Nations, it would appear that the percentage for the oil, gas, and coal sector should be higher, and the percentage for agriculture should be lower. And with regard to agriculture, that is because some of the agricultural emissions should be associated to the background biogenic cycle. So there should be some shift away from that 41 to 44 figure, and that should be added on to the biogenic cycle 35 to 50. But these are just best guesses at the present time. The one thing that we could say with relative confidence is the oil, gas, and coal part of that, 32%, is underreported, and is underreported on a chronic basis in most developed countries and in most jurisdictions. What the European Union wants to do is introduce legislation to get the reporting, the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification of that 32% much better, so that we have the best available data to know what is coming from the oil, gas, and coal sectors for the future. And then once we have that data, we will be able to attack the emissions that we see on the types of technologies that you have shown us today. If we can bring down methane emissions, particularly from the oil, gas, and coal sector, by 90%, it will have an effect of about 0.1 degrees by 2050 in avoided warming, 0.1 degrees Celsius of avoided warming by 2050. And that's a huge amount. If we could reduce 50% of all emissions in all anthropogenic circumstances, then we would increase to 0.18 degrees Celsius by 2050. But the areas which it is easiest to do something now, it's definitely in the oil, gas, and coal sector. For natural gas, methane emissions have been a design factor for the operation of fossil gas infrastructure in the past. Rather than collecting this methane emissions, the companies have been allowing it to be released. And that is the area that we should focus on immediately. For the European Union and for the global community, the figure that we should bear in mind is that lost fossil gas methane in total is about 180 billion cubic meters of gas per year, which is the equivalent of all of the production of Russia. And we should collect that, and we should force the collection of that. The question is, how do we do it? Within the European Union, we don't produce the gas, so we have to persuade others to collect it. And I'm hoping that in December, we will have a very strong set of legal tools presented as an option from the European Union. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Brendan. Just in time, I was just about to interrupt you. So thank you for the insights and for showing that graph that picked up a few questions already. We will come back to some legislative talks. And I also see quite a few questions around the global methane pledge. So get ready to answer some of those as well. As we move along geographically speaking, I now pass the floor to an Italian scientist named Nicola Armaroli. He is a chemist, research director at the Italian National Research Council, and also director of the scientific magazine Sapere, and a member of the Italian National Academy of Science. He has published a lot of different articles, over 250 scientific articles and 8 books on energy and environmental issues. And he has been active in Italy during the methane campaign as well. So Nicola, please, what are your reactions as a scientist to these findings? And yeah, just tell us a little bit more about your experience also with regards to the industry in Italy. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for this invitation. Well, I've tried to point out the problem of methane leakages in Italy for several years without much attention, I would say. And at last, I was so glad when I was contacted by James when he was about to start the monitoring campaign in Italy with Clean Air Task Force. Well, the methane issue in Italy is particularly relevant because Italy is possibly the most methanized country in the Western world. The share of gas consumption in primary energy in Italy is over 40%. It is the only European and G7 country in which methane overtakes oil as the top primary energy source. So it's a big problem for my country. This has historical reasons. Italy started to exploit its own resources of methane in the 1950s in order to power its economic boom. But then there was not so much of this gas, unfortunately, and we started to import gas starting from the 70s. And this was done by connecting Italy through thousands of kilometers of pipelines all the way to Russia, Netherlands, Algeria, and so on. So due to these connections, Italy is a key European hub for gas. And now Italy has recently started to export gas. So gas is not only going inbound to Italy, but also outbound. And due to our track record, our background, this transportation and distribution network is old, of course. Though the gas companies claim that they put a lot of care in maintaining this network. Well, when I saw with my own eyes the James infrared camera, it was to my big surprise to see, for example, that a large geological storage facility in northern Italy that I know very well seemed to emit continuously 24 hours a day from its 85 tall cold stack, despite the fact that in principle this cold stack should be used only during maintenance activities and emergency. But James came twice to Italy and spotting that facility, and it was always emitting. One specific problem with Italy is that many large gas infrastructures in our country are located in the Po Valley in northern Italy, which is one of the most polluted, air polluted areas in the world due to the fact that it's highly industrialized, highly populated, and it has unfavorable wind conditions. And methane is also a health problem. It's not only a climate problem because it is a precursor of ozone, and ozone in Italy is causing 3,000 deaths per year according to the European Environment Agency. So we don't need more deliberately released gas to produce ozone as a secondary pollutant. Another big problem is that in Italy, as probably everywhere else in Europe, leakages are not measured, but they are estimated. And they are estimated by the gas companies. And the gas companies give their data estimation to the ISPRA, which is the National Institute of Environmental Protection. They publish the inventory of greenhouse gas emission in Italy using the data from the gas companies. Well, according to this inventory, the fugitive emission from the oil and gas sector in Italy amounts to 4.2 megaton of CO2 equivalent of emissions, which is exactly 100% of the emission countrywide. This value is, according always again to this inventory, is about half the amount of methane released by cattle through enteric fermentation. But due to the fact that possibly these oil and gas fugitive emissions are underestimated, this value must be much higher, and this is most likely the case. And finally, last but not least, let me point out this key issue, which is also very important to me. What is happening is an unacceptable wasting of natural resources. For example, in Italy, we import methane, a precious resource, all the way as far as from northern Siberia. And then we release it in the atmosphere in one of the most polluted areas in the world, as far as air is concerned, creating a climate and earth damage. So we are making three bad things in one action, very bad things, which is pollution, which is climate, and which is wasting of resources. This is something that I cannot accept as a scientist and even more as a citizen. And just about resources, let me show you a document that was released today, and I am a chemist and I am proud to show it. Lisa, please show it. This is the periodic table of the elements, very spatial, in which each element is as big as it is its abundance on this planet. And we have elements which are largely abundant, and carbon is one of them. But in this version of this table, we have made a change. You see that there are colors in this table. Red means that an element is in danger of supply within the present century. Green means that we have plentiful availability of this element. And you have intermediate colors. So as you see, carbon is a very unique case, and this is the change that we made and we published today. It has three colors. Carbon is green because it is plentiful in the atmosphere, in the lithosphere. It is red because it is not usually available. Within 100 years, our hydrocarbon resources will be exhausted. And it is also black because we make wars and there are tensions all over the world about this element. So in short, we could say that carbon is a unique element, and the way we manage carbon will define our capability to live up to the sustainability challenge, and methane is a key part of it, and we have to solve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you for pointing out that methane is not only a climate problem, but also a local air pollution problem and a waste problem, because the gas just goes to waste without being burned for energy. So thank you for pointing that out. And thank you also for emphasizing again that so far estimates oftentimes stem from the industry itself, and that those tend to be underestimated. Again, I advise you to have a look at the market survey published by Deutsche Umwelthilfe, I think earlier this year, that kind of says that relying on voluntary reporting only will not really do the job in the future. So thanks for pointing that out. And now we move towards the policy debate again, because we have become aware of all the issues at stake and the problems. And now the question really is, what can be done about that? And Sasha has already teased some policy demands and solutions. And now we would like to hear from Alessia on that as well. Alessia Virone. She will bring in another Brussels perspective on the issue. She has joined the Clean Air Task Force Brussels team this year as the Government Affairs Manager, and she is in charge of EU policies and advocacy. She promotes at the EU level science-based climate and energy policies aiming at reducing emissions. So please, Alessia, what is your take on the discussion so far?
Thank you very much. And I apologize for the sound. I could not find a quieter place here in Glasgow. So first of all, I would like to stress again why we need methane policies and binding requirements, and why it's supposed to work hand in hand with the rest of the climate policy that we are developing at the moment at the EU level. So this year, we saw that the Commission proposed a comprehensive set of climate policy with the 55 package, But the thing is that this kind of policy that are focusing on carbon dioxide takes time to deliver on the climate change. So what we'll see first, delivered by this policy once they're implemented, is that the CO2 will accumulate at a lowest rate in the atmosphere, since it's a greenhouse gas that stays longer in the atmosphere. With methane, we can see an impact on climate change way faster. And so if we start implementing in parallel policies on methane reduction, that will give us some time for the policy on CO2 to start delivering on the results. So really these two kinds of policy, the methane one and the CO2 one, should really work hand in hand. So as it was mentioned by the other speaker and by my colleague, methane leaks is really a very broad and widespread issue in Europe and abroad. But thankfully, there are lots of existing technical and innovative solutions that allow to seriously reduce these emissions, and especially in the energy sectors. In the past, we saw that a lot of companies already adopt some kind of voluntary commitment, but that did not really deliver global methane reduction. So that really showed that we have a need for binding regulatory rules and EU policies, basically. CATF considered that there are 4 very important points that we expect and that we hope to see in the EU regulation in December for it to be really effective in tackling methane emission. The first one is to have ambitious leak and detection and repair rules with very strong scientific tools requirements and deadline requirements. So in terms of scientific tool, it's very important that the regulation makes sure that we use the best technology available. So at the moment, it's the optical gas camera that my colleague is using, but we need the regulation to also be open to future innovation that could be used for that. In terms of deadline, it's important to have a very clear deadline on how often LDAR will be needed. And for that, science tells us that it should be either 3 months or 1 month. So if we do it every 3 months, we can reduce about 80% of the leaks emission. If we do it every month, then we are reaching 90%. It will also be very important to have a clear deadline for the repairing and reserving, because, for example, in the leaks that James found in Europe, sometimes the company were aware that these leaks were existing for more than 1 year, but did not take measure to repair it. So that's repairing requirement in terms of deadline is going to be really important to have an efficient policy. So that's the first point that needs to be included in the policy. The second one is related to the ban on venting and flaring. So in its methane strategy, the Commission itself acknowledged that venting and flaring is very damaging for the environment. And so that's something we believe that should just be banned. And the best way to do that would be to have a general ban on routing, venting, and flaring, and then to have a list of exceptions, for example, for safety measures where it is allowed. The third point is related to abundant and unused gas and oil wells. So kind of similarly to what was mentioned on coal, we have in Europe a lot of unused and abundant gas and oil wells that are still emitting methane. And so we need to have some kind of rules and program to first monitor this methane emission, but also to take measures to prevent and stop them. And that can be sometimes complicated by the fact that depending on how these sites were decommissioned, sometimes we don't have a clear owner responsible for the sites and the wells. And in that case, we need to find some kind of measure where you have a national or European authorities that takes the needed action to stop the methane leaks. So that was the third point. And the final point that has been mentioned many times already is related to imports. The EU is importing more than 80% of its oil and gas. And so most of the methane emission due to EU consumption actually take place outside of the EU borders. And the only way we can really address the methane emission due to methane emission is also to look at our imports and to clean up the full value chain. So that's why we're very happy to hear that the Commission is planning some kind of measure on imports, because we very much need to make sure that the EU address its domestic emission, but also its global emission, and make sure that you have requirement on the full value chain that ensure that the methane emission are limited also abroad. So that's the 4 points that are very important to have, and we're really happy to see that also all of these points were included in the recent methane report in the European Parliament, and we hope to see them all reflected in the regulation in December. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessia. Thank you for having been with us despite the poor conditions, and thanks to the attendees for having bear with us. Thank you for your insights, and the policy options will be further reason for discussion, I think, for the next few months once the European Commission's proposal is out. I'm now opening the panel discussion where all our speakers will get the chance to speak again, to react to one another, and to also react to your questions. They have already been busy typing some answers to make sure that we answer a maximum of your questions. And to really kickstart the debate, I would like to come back to that global methane pledge, just because it is so timely, so topical, and because we received so many questions around that. So basically several issues were raised. One concerns the ambition. So do you deem the global methane pledge ambitious enough and a helpful tool to really bring methane emissions down within the European Union, but also elsewhere? And how do you react to the fact that some major top emitters, such as China, such as Russia, are not part of that pledge? And how do you feel about the critique that this methane pledge may also serve as a greenwashing excuse? And there was one question on that, to keep the gas industry alive beyond the time of a 1.5 pathway. So maybe we start with you, Brendan, as a representative of the European Commission, and then we'll move on to other speakers.
Let me be as clear as I can be. The major issue in climate is to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. Methane is the secondary problem. The primary objective of European Union energy policy is to reduce to zero unabated natural fossil gas use. That is it. It has to go. There is no querying on that question. The difficulty we have with methane in the oil and gas sector in particular is that if you have a limited time frame for investment, which we do, which is implied by the first statement that you have to get rid of unabated oil and gas use, how do you incentivize or penalize people who hold assets which release methane? And that is the difficulty that we are dealing with at the moment. So to be clear, unabated fossil gas use must end. There is no variety on that question and the answer. On the question of whether the global methane pledge is useful or not, from the perspective of the European Union as the largest purchaser of hydrocarbons in the world, the global methane pledge gives us the political coverage to request or enforce methane emissions in other countries, because we have made a collective statement that that is what we are going to do. And irrespective of whether all the exporters to the European Union have signed up to the methane pledge, it is very clear that the global community of climate activists, the high ambition group, if you want to call it that, or anything else, that we have the political support of everybody who signed up to the pledge to pursue that action. And that is why, for the European Union, the global methane pledge is so important. The European Union itself will reduce its methane emissions by between 35 and 37% by 2030 in any case. So that will be our contribution. We may take it higher to 45 or other levels. These numbers are not unattainable. For example, in the waste sector, we have reduced methane emissions, I think, by between 50 and 60% since 1996, the first methane legislation of the European Union, which was for landfills. That has already had a huge effect. We could take that experience and apply it internationally to other countries, and that would also have the same effect that we have had in the European Union. So these numbers are not unattainable. The difficulty is finding a political and legal framework which allows them to be attained, given that the European Union only has jurisdiction over its own territory and has to either persuade legally or politically others to do things. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to the fact that there's also a lot of evidence already out there that a lot of reductions in the energy sector could be achieved fairly easily and fairly rapidly at low costs. So maybe we can come back to the question of why these low-hanging fruit have not been picked yet. But I see that Nicola is raising his hand, and I also invite the other speakers to think about an answer with regards to the Global Methane Pledge, the ambition and how to get other countries in. So Nicola, please.
I think that we have to be very clear in distinguishing between geographical problems. Let's say we have an internal problem inside the European Union. It is our distribution network, which reaches every single house. So we can do the legislation ourselves, and this is what we have to do. We have big gas companies in Europe, which are the greenest companies in the world. And as you can see, the advertising. So I hope that they are ready to make what they have to do to stop this mess. Regarding the connection with, for example, Russia, which is always taken as an example, it is a big infrastructure, but it's only a limited amount of pipelines, so it is easy to spot them. And I think that since this gas is coming to Europe, it's not difficult to find an agreement with Russia to adjust and to fix problems all across these long lines. So I think that the very problem is inside our borders, because in the metropolitan areas, there is a huge emission of gases, which is completely undetected. There have been studies in recent times in Boston, Philadelphia, and Paris, which has shown that the emission of methane in the metropolitan area is from 2 to 4 times bigger than it was previously estimated. So we have to do a lot of work at home, okay? So that's the key point. And so we have to change the legislation, to make the legislation, and to force the companies, the gas companies, to make what they have to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so speaking about cleaning up the existing gas infrastructure, we also have to think about how much of the emissions can actually be reduced at zero and how much of emissions will just always be there. And also, Brendan, you mentioned the unabated. So I'd like to pass the floor to Sasha again with regards to also the question, I think it was Sabine von Mehring who asked that one, that also coming back to the pledge, isn't that again an incentive to keep investing in new gas infrastructure, as long as that is the narrative that the gas industry just needs to be cleaned up, and how can we further incentivize a shift towards the goal of 100% renewables?
Yeah, thank you. So basically, obviously there's a big risk here. Obviously, us as an environmental organization, see that risk as well. I mean, in terms of the methane pledge, we really welcome that this has happened so far, but at the same time, we always connect that message with the fact that we say the ambition needs to be risen, and the ambition also is not an excuse, or let's say, abating or mitigating methane leakages at net zero cost is not an excuse to, for example, build new infrastructure. So we know quite well how long we'll still need fossil gas, how much we need of it. We know from that, for example, in Germany, but also in Europe, new fossil gas infrastructure, import infrastructure is completely unnecessary. And for this reason, DOH is also advocating against Nord Stream 2 or new LNG terminals. So what we're saying is for the infrastructure that is still there, we need to reduce emissions as much as possible. And that's why we've also asked in our methane pricing study to put an import tariff on that. But this question always, in our view, needs to be connected to the question of a fossil gas exit. Whether that is in Germany or Europe, we need to ask those questions now, because obviously there's a lot of time that needs to go into these debates, and Europe is still heavily hooked on fossil gas. But we must not make the mistake to make this connection worse or this dependence. That's why we need to ask those questions now and talk about how can we actually get to a point where we can exit fossil gas in terms of energy consumption, at least completely. The methane pricing study that we've put out is tackling this exactly, but also in terms of the methane pledge, this is exactly what's the kind of the dilemma of international negotiations. If you want to have a lot of people signing on, then the ambition level will be low. If the ambition level is higher, you won't have so many people that will sign on to those pledges. So this is why we, for example, also welcome the Parliament initiative with their own initiative report saying we have to put a fee or some sort of tariff on gas that is imported right now. But again, this needs to be connected to the question of a fossil gas exit, and new import infrastructure is, at least for Germany and Europe as a whole, not necessary at that moment, and actually really dangerous.
Thank you. I think you excellently muted yourself just prior to your ending, but we got the sense of your last sentence.
No, that was important. I said it's actually dangerous. I just wanted to highlight this. I mean, sometimes we forget about what we are talking about, but we are in a climate crisis, and building new fossil infrastructure is somewhat crazy, but you tend to forget that if you're kind of in the, in your tunnel sometimes.
Coming back to you, James, and a few technical questions also in the Q&A. You have answered some of them, but Sasha, you also briefly touched upon that, the difficulty of international and even EU-wide enforcement, monitoring, etc. The European Commission, as far as I understand, hopes that the International Methane Emissions Observatory will help to monitor commitments made by the pledges signatories. But how can we use the methodology that you have developed to have like a common standard to measure methane emissions and to get more clarity, and therefore also a better idea of how to act on them?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, so it's really important to remember that this optical gas imaging camera is just one tool in the toolbox. When we think of methane emissions reduction in the oil and gas sector, we need to be thinking of the whole system of what we have available. The IMEO, when it really comes online, is going to be a valuable asset in the fight to reduce methane emissions worldwide. And you now have, starting next year, several new satellites that are going to be deployed specifically to look at methane emissions across the world. And so you'll have EDF coming online with the methane sat, and Carbon Mapper with a number of different satellites between 2023 and 2025. And what we really need is to figure out, and what we're going to be doing over the next couple of years, figuring out how to get those regulations in place worldwide, working with countries that have signed on to the methane pledge and are encouraged to reduce their methane emissions reduction using both the satellite technologies we have, but also just the policies and regulations that are required on the ground to reduce emissions. The work that Brendan is doing on the Commission to introduce regulations within the EU is going to incorporate all sorts of systems to reduce methane emissions and technologies. You can't just rely on the satellites entirely. While it's going to be amazing to have these available to us, we also need smart policies such as frequent leak detection and repair programs using best available technologies at the ground level. the satellites aren't going to be able to spot everything, but they're going to be able to see a lot more than we're able to see today.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Alessia, so monitoring, reporting, verification, LDAR, etc. This is to be expected from the proposal in the methane regulation. But we also have another question with regards to how policymakers should deal with methane. And that is the technical side of the global warming potential and using numbers that are more relevant. So there's one question saying that, so Sasha mentioned that we should use the global warming potential 20 alongside global warming potential over the 100-year time frame when reporting. Would you agree, and what is your stance on that? And do you want to react to any other policy issues that were raised during the debate until now?
On the global warming potential, we believe we need a combination of the 20 and the 100. Because if we only focus on the 20, then we are underestimating the CO2 impact. And if we're only working with the 100, there we underestimated and under-promoting measure on methane. So we really need to have both of them working together to have some kind of optimal translation of the greenhouse gas emission. And I don't think that it's going to be, but please correct me if I'm wrong, the focus of the regulation coming up in December, but in other legislation that are currently being discussed, you do have equation and a quantity number when they use only the global warming potential 100, and where also they use kind of an outdated version of the methane one. And that's also something that needs to be discussed at the EU level.
Thank you. Maybe just briefly coming back to that question of monitoring, a new question just came in whether the camera technology could also be used to monitor cattle, because no methane event can happen without also mentioning agricultural emissions, even though we have already done so with your methane tree, for instance, Brendan. And this event really focuses on the energy sector, but still it would be interesting to understand in what way that could be helpful as well. And there's another question that is fairly high up on that list. How are the point measurements extrapolated to Europe? I don't think that you have answered that yet, James.
Sure. So, my estimates for Europe and what I've observed is really just should be seen as observational, right? We aren't trying to make necessarily claims on quantification across Europe in terms of emissions. The camera's not able to do that, but we're able to show that the problem is systemic everywhere that I have been in Europe, and that's 11 countries so far with plans to travel to more countries next year. I fully expect when we travel to those countries that we'll also see these emissions there as well. With regards to cattle, no, unfortunately, the camera can't visualize methane emissions in cattle. There are other ways of quantifying the emissions itself from the cattle industry and agriculture. Satellites can also provide that technology when you're looking at larger areas as well. And so, yeah, the camera is not necessarily a tool for other industries outside of oil and gas. Where it really works well because it's used to find and fix repairs, and that's what it's primarily designed to do.
Detecting and fixing repairs, there was a question about other super emitters within the European Union's borders, such as the petrochemical industry. So how does the methane regulation impact those? And there's another question by David Cole Hamilton that you, Brendan, said that we do need an exit of fossil gas entirely unabated. And is there a time scale on this, and how does the European Commission already prepare such a managed decline?
You're asking me.
Yes. Sorry. If
on
that
the managed decline.
Managed decline and tackling the super emitters inside the European Union's borders, such also including the petrochemical industry, etc.
Yeah, the super emitters inside the European Union's border, I don't know. There certainly are some in the former coal fields of Silesia. I wonder to what extent, I mean, I turn to James and others to tell me where there might be others. Chronic super emitters. There might be, there was a blowdown once, for example, in northern Bavaria, which created a methane plume, but it was for a couple of days and then they closed the pipe. So chronic super emitters, other than in the former coal fields of Silesia and potentially other coal fields, I think there might be one in northern Spain. I'm not sure where we have chronic emission points, but I would have to defer to the scientists on that. If it is about chronic emission points, then we have simply an issue of closing and properly sealing mines. And that is something that can be dealt with in the context of the just transition or in other ways. And I guess there may be chronic emission points from open cast mining. But again, I'm at the limit of my technical knowledge. And the other question was exactly, what was the other question?
How does the European Commission prepare a managed decline and an exit from fossil gas?
It's a very good question. And it's one I don't have an answer for, but it's certainly one we are thinking about. And at this time, for the rundown of fossil assets, particularly networks in the European Union, we don't have a roadmap, partially because there are many ideas how to reuse the infrastructure. Hydrogen is clearly one option that is widely discussed. Local networks can be used for biogas productions. For oil, it's a whole different question. But it is an interesting question. A more interesting way of looking at that is when we come to the point of reducing demand in the European Union, which is going to be somewhere between 2025 and 2035 for oil, gas, and coal, depending on which scenario you think is likely for the European Union, which demand scenario. How will we go about thinking of demand, reducing demand? Will we leave it to the market, or will there be some other intervening mechanism to guide our choices? But that, I think, is as far as we've got. But we are thinking about it actively for the future. Thank you.
Looking at the time, I'd like to invite our speakers for some closing remarks, maybe 1 to 2 minutes each max. So let's start with Sascha, because the Deutsche Umwelthilfe has done extensive work already on that question of a managed decline.
Thank you, Lisa. So, yeah, I mean, we are at a decisive point in history. I think a lot of people are slowly realizing more and more what is actually at stake and how fast we actually need to move in order to mitigate or avoid the worst consequences of climate breakdown. I think we are in a good position in terms of what we can do in the short term, in terms of reducing emissions, methane emissions from the oil and gas, but also from agriculture and from other sectors. And in terms of the midterm solutions, I think we have to start talking about this main elephant in the room, which is the fossil gas exit, because as Brandon says, and that as has been mentioned a couple of times this evening, we need to get away from all fossil fuels if we are to solve this. Brandon, I'm really excited about what the European Commission might come up with in terms of ideas how to manage this. We certainly know that we will monitor European gas industries in our market survey. Last year, none of them told us that they actually planned a fossil gas exit date. They were setting on offsetting or CCS, which we think are not feasible options in order to solve the crisis we are faced with. But I'm optimistic that we can move forward and that we will find solutions to this issue. The expertise in this room shows me that there is some hope for this to still happen.
Thank you. Alessia, some closing remarks live from COP.
Again, sorry for the sound. No, I would say that it's very positive to see the momentum that has been built around methane in Europe and abroad. And that really just on this last year, how many more countries start adopting measures on methane to reduce their own emission, and to see with the Global Methane Pledge that you have more and more attention on this issue. So that makes me cautiously optimistic about what will happen in the future in terms of methane emission reduction. And I say cautiously because obviously imports remain very important, and the only way we're really going to address methane emission is also by addressing import emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicola, our scientist here among the speakers. What's your take? What do people still need to understand about methane? And do you agree with the analysis that at least now there is more momentum? Do you feel that this is enough? You are still muted. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I think that people have to realize that we don't need rocket science to fix the problem. As James has shown, sometimes it's just a matter of screwing something, you know. And in most cases, it's something like that. So there are easy fixes for this problem. The second point is sometimes people ask me why companies let this gas going out, because it's money, but it's a few percent for them, a few fraction of percent sometimes. But since we are talking about billions and billions and billions of cubic meters of gas, it's a huge amount for climate and for health at the local level. So that's another point. They are not interested in doing that until the regulation obliges them to do so. Third, I think that the control authorities should have near infrared camera to make the job, because, for example, in Italy, they don't have. It's not a matter of money, because they have, of course, the money to buy them, but they never felt the need to buy them. So we have to push a lot for this to be done. So again, it's a matter of regulation. And finally, mitigation actions are being studied by science. Somebody is proposing to flood all the abandoned coal mines to stop the release of methane. So there are also options, also in that case, which are not very expensive. So we can do more, we must do more. That's my final message.
Thanks, Nicola. And we started with James, and we will end with an intervention by James. Maybe you also want to pick up the question about super emitters again inside the European Union's borders, or other abandoned coal mines. Up to you for your closing remarks.
Great, and thank you everyone who's taken part in this conversation, and all the attendees who have asked such great questions today. This has been wonderful. And I'm happy to see Brendan taking part in answering some great questions, these issues. So I'm going to skip over abandoned coal mines, because I don't work directly on abandoned coal mines too much, but I will talk a little bit about the super emitters that we've been looking at. It's hard to necessarily classify. I don't want to jump to conclusion to say something immediately is a super emitter. A lot of people have different terminologies for what a super emitter is, but I've seen some very large events across Romania and Italy. And my observations are based on qualitative assessments of what I've seen after visiting over 11 countries and more than 250 sites. So are these classified as your typical super emitter? We know that we're not seeing them in the satellites that we currently have available. Will we be able to see them in a few years when we have new satellites? I think we will. But as Brendan says, maybe these aren't as continuous. There's a lot of intermittency with super emitting events. We see this across the globe, both in the Permian and in Russia, as well as other countries too. Sometimes super emitter events aren't always continuous, but they might be one-off events that last a day or two because they're releasing gas into the air. But yet it happens to be many tons of gas, which is what we need to work to prevent. Now, on that note, I do want to end on a very, optimistic note and reiterate what we've been talking about and what's been happening at COP. The global methane pledge is incredibly important. The work that the EU Commission is working on with the methane strategy is incredibly important because, methane mitigation is going to be something that we're going to be able to see in our lifetimes. If we can reduce methane emissions this decade, we will see a slow growth in the rate of warming over the next 2 to 3 decades. And that's something to be cheerful about. We don't have many great things looking forward to us sometimes in the climate fight. And with methane, I think we do. As we start to see methane concentrations in the atmosphere reduce, we're going to start to see the slower growth of warming. And that's something I want everyone to remember when they're thinking about methane mitigation and the work on methane emissions.
Thank you. I don't really have a lot to add to these wonderful closing remarks. I hope that we could provide all of you with some new insights and food for thought and how to take it from there. Again, I would like to reiterate why we are talking about this. It is not only necessary to reduce methane emissions from a climate standpoint of view, but also with regards to air pollution and waste. And improving monitoring only will definitely not do the job. There's lots of readily available techniques already out there, how we could bring down emissions fairly quickly. And this definitely is a low-hanging fruit. The International Energy Agency estimates that roughly 40% of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector could be saved at zero or very, very low costs. So as someone said, I don't remember who, let's get the job done. Thank you to all our speakers for having taken the time. Thank you to all of our attendees for having been so active in the Q&A tool in the chat. And please visit the website methanemoment.org and stay tuned for any other events that are coming up throughout COP until November 12th on that issue. Thank you so much. And